Darling.
And I'm Hannah Glaver.
We used to work together at an evangelical church that held a hierarchical position on gender roles.
A church that believed God had chosen men to fulfill the primary roles of spiritual leadership.
This environment created some unique and significant challenges for us and the other women among us as we strive to pursue our respective callings.
From wage gaps and androcentric hiring practices
to sexist standards and marginalizing expectations.
We've reconnected to explore and process our experiences as well as the systemic issues behind them.
And hopefully, we'll shed some light on why gender hierarchy can't represent God's best for women, the church, or humanity.
This is Stained Glass Ceiling. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Stained Glass Ceiling. This week, we had the opportunity to talk with local pastor, friend, and former coworker Bill Clem to revisit the Billy Graham rule. Bill has 4 decades of pastoral work under his belt in a variety of settings and has recently stepped into more of a spiritual direction and pastor for pastors role, bringing a lot of healing and teaching healthy patterns to many people in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. When he joined our staff, it brought a notable change to the experience of women leaders, most certainly to Ailin, Kenya, Becca, Abby, and myself, and we thought that he'd be the perfect person to invite to speak on this topic. We had a wonderful time and an amazing conversation, and we hope you enjoy it too.
So we are talking to Pastor Bill Clem. Each of us on this sort of podcast project have some experience with you, Bill. We all worked together at the same church for quite a bit of time. You did my premarital counseling. Were you Hannah's boss?
You're executive.
Exactly, boss's boss. Yeah. And Kenya fired you. Kenya, our producer, decided she no longer wanted to work for you, so she fired you and moved on to a different role.
How good did it feel just saying, "You're done, buddy"?
It was a hard decision. I want to say I didn't just fire him because I didn't like him. I love Bill. But I was wearing too many hats. I was working for 3 people, and I had to let Bill go. I'm sorry.
Bill, can you give us a quick description of what it is that you do today?
Well, I lead retreats for spiritual leaders, specifically pastors, and trying to help the average person who has leadership in a church get a focus on leading rather than on results. So that's kind of like my end game or hope out of that. I don't work full time. I spend time working with my kids and my grandkids, and just kind of probably trying to put a work balance that I should have had for 40 years.
That's awesome. So yeah, at the time when we all worked together, you were on sort of the executive level pastoral staff for the church. And kind of what we wanted to sort of converse with you about is your experience with, we've been calling it the Billy Graham rule, but basically rules that are put into place wherein men are advised or trained to avoid meeting one-on-one with women, whether it's in a work context or otherwise, in order to protect their reputations. So yeah, we'd just love to get your perspective on what your experience is with that practice and that sort of ministry standard, I suppose. So to start off with, what's your experience been? How did you encounter it, if at all? And
it's interesting. I think almost every time I was reminded or informed of a policy or an expectation like that, it was always kind of like retro. Like I would have already gone somewhere in a car with a woman or had a meal with a staff person or somebody in ministry, and then I come back and somebody else on staff would go, "Oh, what did you do? You're not supposed to do that." It really wasn't the idea that it was part of an onboarding process to a staffing position or anything like that. So in that way, I guess it was way more of an unspoken expectation than a stated policy.
We did talk about that a little bit with modesty codes as well, where you sometimes only find the line once you've crossed it.
Yeah.
Did you ever practice the rule? Maybe even in that context where you were told in your ministry environment, oh, you can't do that. And what was that like?
I was a youth pastor for almost 2 decades, and so when I started, I was only a couple years older than the seniors in high school, and so at that point, I was way more almost of a peer. And when you're dealing with, predominantly when you're dealing with youth, you're dealing with people that are just starting to mature. You're not talking about a mature person. So in some ways, the maturity of the people you're working with dictates a little bit the freedoms you have as well. So I had more freedom with women who were on staff with me, whether they were volunteer or paid, than I did with students that I was particularly working with. As I got a little bit older and was a big brother, that was a different feel. And then as I became a dad, so to speak, and their parents were my age, that even took on a different role, So there was really even that kind of shift. And so I think for me, the rule wasn't something that I was trying to establish as much as trying to figure out where are people's comfort zones, whether that's parents or staff or, eventually I was a youth pastor before I was married. So after I was married, even the role my wife or the voice my wife had into my decisions started to play part of that, Then as I started transitioning out of youth ministry into working first with university students and then with church staffs, it started to be more of a kind of thing where I never felt that pressure to make sure that there was an appropriate and inappropriate boundary that was set and to make sure I was living in the appropriate. But I do know that there were people who wanted to know why I felt the liberty to do that, rather than the idea I shouldn't feel the liberty. I really didn't have that too often, as I recall. I know at one church I was at, it was a real hierarchical system, almost like a chain of command type thing. And the only people that were baptizing were men, okay? But we let deacons who were men baptize the parishioners in our church, and we had women who were deacons. And so one of the deacons was my admin, and I asked her if she wanted to baptize people on Sunday, and she goes, I can do that? And I went, I think so. If the bar is being a deacon, you're a deacon.
Right.
And so then she told one of the other ladies who worked at the church, and she goes, well, I'm a deacon. And so I said, yeah, you can baptize people too. And then the executive pastor called me and goes, hey, I heard that we're going to have women baptizing people on Sunday. I went, yeah. He goes, can we do that? I said, yeah, I think we can if we're saying it's deacon. I've never read anything or heard anything that said it had to be men, but it was just assumed, Right. So, and then, there were multiple campuses, and within a month, every campus had women that were in the tank.
It sounds like, based on the experiences you just shared, that you sort of started off from a place of being comfortable meeting with women one-on-one in sort of like maybe a work meal situation. What have your experiences been with the maybe the consequences or the challenges of not being comfortable with that, of being in a place where you say, to hold our standards, we don't meet one-on-one with women?
I think part of the issue is that if there are things that you want to have a voice into someone's life about, it prohibits you from having that voice in their life. I'm sure there are things that you can talk to someone else, like, a woman on your staff or a volunteer or whatever, to go say the same things, but you miss the opportunity to be able to have that mentoring or pastoring role in someone's life when you make that rigid wall. One of the things that's good about what I've done in ministry is that I see people's potential and invite people to it. And I don't think that if you see someone's potential and you ask someone else to invite them to it, that they hear that you saw it, And so I didn't want to lose my voice, and I do think that you can lose your voice in people's lives through policies.
Right. And that can be pretty vital in the context of ministry development, I'd say, of if you're sort of supervisor or pastor above you is a person of the opposite sex, like they should still have, to a certain degree, that voice in your life of what is God saying to you about your vocation? what can you learn from me? What can I learn from you?
Yeah, I remember a time when I was a student in college, and I was working as a youth pastor at a church, and it was an all-church retreat, and they did communion at the end, and the way they did communion was you'd go up to the table, and there was someone behind the table that would serve you the elements, and then after you'd taken the elements, then you went behind the table and served the next person. And so I remember on that retreat, I went up, and I don't remember who served me, honestly, but when I went behind the table, the lead pastor came up, and I served him, and I remember that. And so being able to put yourself in positions where it isn't just let me serve you, but it's actually you get the opportunity to use your gifts and serve me, or our relationship and serve me, that kind of gets stunted as well. And I think that's a tragedy, because when you can look at the idea that that person who has an authority or just even a position of esteem in your life values you enough to let you minister to them, that's a big deal in affirmation and ministry tracking, I think.
One thing we've talked a little bit about in our conversation is the idea of, well, is this practice biblical? Do we see it prescribed in the Bible that these kinds of prohibitions are a standard we should keep to in order to flourish as we follow the gospel and as we follow Jesus Christ? What do you think about that? Do you see biblical evidence supporting this kind of thing?
I do think that there are places in Scripture to call for discretion, and sometimes I think that has to do with a person who has a reputation, and you're trying to avoid being associated with that reputation, but I don't think that's a gender thing, I do think that it's really hard to untangle that knot between our current condition and a scripture that is in some ways agricultural, in other ways tribal and familial, So you're bringing all that into an industrial, isolated, radical, individualistic society and saying, what does the Bible say about this? And I'm kind of saying, that's the beauty of Scripture, is that there's something that is a truth below a culture. And so if we're asking a cultural question, we either have to go down to what is the question below our culture and see what their culture, how they addressed it, rather than just saying, what does the culture of that day say about the culture of our day? Because there's probably a miss on that. There's nothing in Scripture about the internet. There's nothing in Scripture about movies, And so, but there probably are things about communication and how we communicate with one another and how we renew our mind or guard our heart,
What biblical text have you heard used to support this kind of rule?
I would say that the primary text is the one that says, avoid all appearance of evil, right? And I grew up in a time with a mom and a dad. My dad wasn't a believer at the time I was growing up. My mom was. And she grew up in kind of a legalistic, conservative church environment. So that wasn't just used for this. It was used for cards. It was used for movies. It was used for dancing. All the things that I wanted to do. there was the leash. You can't go over there. And so, the avoiding the appearance of evil can be really a crazy thing, because we want to say we know what it means to avoid it, but we don't really know what appearance of evil means. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that I think is one of the champion passages. I think another probably goes into the whole idea of role of women. I know that's outside of our purview, but when you start talking about women should teach women, men should teach men, I've heard that, so that there's a biblical precedent for keeping the genders separated, right? And so those are primary verses that kind of get put into an arsenal, I think.
Yeah. One we talked about a little bit was from the Modesto Manifesto, which is actually where Billy Graham and his ministry team first sort of set this standard down, and they used 2 Timothy 1:20, which is flee youthful lusts.
Okay.
And so that kind of ignited this conversation of, well, what happens when you begin to see members of the opposite sex through the lens of potential objects of lust? Well, what do you think about that?
Okay, so let's look at two of those. First one, I just want to look at the flee youthful lust. One would be, does that take people that aren't youth out of the picture? You know what I mean?
Good question.
A second part of it would be the whole idea, discernment is actually one of the gifts, right? And I mean, it was a big time thing of the early church. St. Ignatius has chapters on discernment. And when you start looking at, okay, there's a passage that says flee lust, I get that. But then you look at James and it says, resist the devil and he'll flee from you. So when you're looking at that, you need to say, hey, is this a lust thing that I need to prevent? Or is this a spiritual attack that I need to, hit as a front and resist? I mean, so just even in the whole idea of flee youthful lust, it's not just a broad stroke that you can paint everything with, as far as putting that on. I'll just tell you my bias. I think that when you listen to the average speaker talk about what it looks like to be spirit-filled, they're usually talking about the things that have been sanctifying acts in their life. And when they talk about sin, it's usually the things that they'll never be tempted towards. And that those are the worst sins. And, I think we could say, hey, look at the whole idea of same-sex attraction. So somebody who isn't attracted to the same sex is going to make that the big banner that they can use to, hit all sin with. And so if you're a person that is fighting the whole idea of your own lustful pulls, and that's why you have made a manifesto or some kind of rule that says, I'm not going to go there, you start making that what everybody should do rather than that's your personal conviction. And I do think that being aware of your own limitations is huge, So for me, it's really important that I am honest and aware with myself enough to know, am I attracted to somebody? And if I'm attracted to somebody, that puts a cautionary procedure into play,
Right. Rather than an across-the-board
way
we treat each other.
And I don't even think attraction is a lust to flee from, you know what I mean? I mean, there is something in the Bible called sin. I do believe that. But I don't believe temptation is sin. I mean, Jesus was tempted, and yet he was without sin. So even the idea it's tempting doesn't mean that we're supposed to necessarily say, because it's a temptation, it's the same as sin.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. Do you think there are learnings from the Bible or examples in the Bible that model something different or have something different to say about how to handle this issue?
Well, I do think that the Bible has a high view and a dignity-granting view of women. And I don't think that has been the case in an evangelical church over the last 100 years. I don't think we have a good track record. And I'll put myself as part of that. That is my heritage,
Yeah, same.
But I think, for example, when you hear Paul write in Philippians, I plead with you, Euodia and Syntyche, that you might agree with each other in the Lord. He's talking about fellow workers of the gospel, and it's two women. And somehow that was a critical issue to be addressed in that church. You see teachers like Aquila and Priscilla, and I read the scriptures as that they were a mentoring voice, both of them, in the life of Apollos, who was just a stellar communicator. So somehow, and in Romans 16, Paul mentions a name called Junius, and I do believe that's a feminine name, and he connects being an apostle with her. Okay, so when we look at the idea, what does the New Testament say about women, and avoiding? I mean, you're not going to avoid an apostle. You're not going to avoid a teacher like Priscilla, and you're not going to avoid Euodia and Syntyche because they're part of the fabric of that church.
So we've talked a lot about the fact that church ministry is still a largely male-dominated space. So what do you think that we lose when strict limits are placed on collaboration between men and women?
Okay, that's a fair question. I think that when we say ministry is predominantly a male-dominated space, we're talking about the vocational I mean, if you were to look at the church is predominantly women, right? I mean, over 50% mark. And so it is really weird that you have predominantly men leading predominantly women.
Yeah.
I'm not a good enough historian to really go there, but I have a sneaking suspicion that how we just painted women in ministry in the New Testament had a radical change to the role of women in the church when the church started paying for their staff. When it was a volunteer position, I have a feeling that women were allowed to be co-leaders. And the minute it became salaried, now it was a man's job.
Wow.
I've never thought of that once.
No.
Oh my gosh. One of the reasons that I'm happy to have you here, Bill, is you're a spiritual formation director. You are all about discipleship and raising up people well. And I know that you've had your experience with burnout over the years, and you've watched a lot of people burn out in the same ways. And so you're passionate about finding new ways to restructure ministry in such a way that's sustainable and is honoring of people's time, their bodies, their mental health, everything. And so I know you've put together a series of kind of cohorts that like really emphasize this overarching health. And I know from knowing you and also the way that it's been formatted that it started as strictly for men. But I know that's not you. I know that you want ministry to be much more inclusive. And so now there's currently a separate women's cohort. And the problem that I have with it, when I heard that you were doing this, I was really excited about it. And I was like, I want to be in that cohort. I have tons of experiences in this. And I want to like be able to talk with co-leaders about burnout and about health and like how do we have healthy structures in church. But when I heard that it was strictly for men, I was pretty bummed out because it didn't sound like something that fully fit with who you are and what I know you're passionate about. And the idea of like adding another only women's group, it makes it that bummed me out. And I know in the future you hope for integration, but could I hear you talk about one a little bit, maybe some of the reasons behind the separation and maybe some of the hesitation of some of the people in the group? What would those fears be? Why would there be limitations there? Because I know that you're moving forward just with what you can do and what you've been asked to do. But what would some maybe men and women's hesitation be in that integration? Because to me it sounds exciting to integrate, but not to everybody.
Yeah. So kind of the charge given to me was, can you develop some kind of delivery system to help pastors pursue flourishing rather than just realize that the only time they get help is when they need help? Is there anything that could be preventative rather than restorative? Okay, so that's what was kind of the vision that was laid out, and I was invited to come and be an architect to that. And from the get-go, I said, okay, what are we going to do with the women who are pastors? And so I have a friend, she has her PhD in spiritual formation, and so I asked her if she would lead a cohort for women in ministry. And so she's led 3 of them now, and I have a bunch of women. I probably have 15 women who are going, I'm not really interested in jumping into a cohort with all women. In fact, one of the women who did go into the cohort asked my colleague who leads that cohort, hey, I don't want the reading list for this course. I want the reading list that the men do in their cohort. Yeah. So we started integrating the same, formational literature. And that was helpful for me. Ailin, you asked me what one of the things we miss, and that is one of the things we miss, is that we don't realize, okay, there's got to be probably 3 sets here. What are the things that are unique to men in ministry? What are the things that are unique to women in ministry? And then what's the common shared pool, which I think is probably larger than the unique pools,
Totally.
So that kind of became the impetus, and I have an associate now who she wants to lead a cohort, and I believe that she'll probably have to field one with women first because it's just the nature of our clientele. but she and I are working on trying to figure out how are we going to open one up that's both genders together. And I think that it would be important for her and I to lead it together so that we model what we're inviting people into, you know. If I was going to say what's the biggest fear and why would women be more interested in being in a cohort than men are going to be interested in being in a cohort, I would say women look at the cohort in a lot of ways as an equipping thing, and men look at it as a place to be honest and maybe have an attachment that they're not getting somewhere else, so I'm going to have a collegial relationship with some men, okay? But I have a feeling that there are a lot of men who one of the issues they're going to wrestle with is porn, okay? And I have a feeling that if a guy were to reveal that in a cohort that's mixed gender, that he's afraid he's going to be judged right away, you know? So men are saying, no, I need to be in a cohort where it's just us guys and we understand what we're wrestling with, rather than somebody who go, oh, man, I don't understand that. And to me, that's part of what we miss, is the idea of, okay, if there are two different values that are colliding, or two things that just miss each other even, how do we still make that a place where we become soul friends? You know, and that's really what, like when I form a cohort, I say, you don't have to be best friends the rest of your life with the people who are in this cohort, but I want you to learn the skill of being a best friend in this cohort.
If you could dream something different, like in a best case scenario, like gender fears off the table, what would co-leading and co-pastoring and even developing alongside men and women, what would that look like? Like, we know what the limits are and we know what's not happening. What would it look like? And maybe even pull in like a biblical understanding.
I think it would be way more team. Most people, the minute you put a limitation on them, that's what they want, right? I mean, that's the whole story of the garden. I mean, I'm sure that the Trinity's up there going, oh my gosh, look at this garden, and they're focused on the one tree they can't eat of rather than the hundreds that they could, you know? And that's where I'm going, is that tree. And so when we look at the idea that we're going to reserve a particular office for men, they've got women are going, that's the office I need to have, right? And rather than the idea of, okay, what would it look like if we, in a sense, didn't have some kind of power differential to those, you know? So like when you have somebody who goes, men are this way, women are this way, and you put it into a marriage, okay? It falls apart real quick when you start to say, so how are we really going to live, you know? The wait till your father gets home kind of phrase really is not a good phrase for building relationships. It's just put somebody over an authoritarian camp, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're robbing them of the relational component. So like when my children were young, I have 4 kids, and so Wednesday was breakfast with Dad, and we just rotated all 4 kids. They all got a Wednesday with Dad, because I wanted conversations before I had to have the disciplinary conversation. You know, I wanted to be building an account when I had to make that withdrawal. And I don't think that we have any concept of building an account between men and women. We're just looking at the idea, how can we have a transactional interaction? You know, oh, we're going to have an event at Christmas. Quick, get some women on the committee because we need to talk about decorations, you know? So that becomes part of the issue. I mean, like, I've been married twice, and both wives that I've had, and I don't think I sat down and vetted them on skill sets, but both women, you know, like my first wife, there was a Christmas where I said, hey, what do you want for Christmas? She wanted a miter saw, a power miter saw, you know? I'm going, okay, and my job was to write the Christmas letter, okay? And then my current wife asked me one time, hey, what do you want for your birthday? I said, well, I'd like an Instapot, you know? And she's kind of going, what? You know? And so those are things that we traditionally think are male and female, rather than the idea, hey, in the context of a relationship, what are our skills? What are our passions? What are our abilities? And kind of sharing those rather than roles dictate what those can be expressed as.
One thing that's interesting is the focus of these rules often seems to be on avoiding the appearance of sin, so sort of a reputations thing, rather than sinful behavior alone, right? So this seems to create a barrier even between us and the people we trust. So even a woman in your case, or a man in my case, who I trust, there's still this potential for it to be out of bounds in the context of what this rule is saying. Why this focus on appearance and reputations? Like, do you think that it's a valid priority for people in leadership roles?
That's a great question. I've known people both in ministry and in other vocations where there's close interaction with the opposite sex. So let's say, for example, I know a guy who was a school teacher, and one of the students in his class accused him of an inappropriate relationship, and he was immediately on suspension. There's an investigation, and 6 or 7 months later, he was vetted, but the reputation's already shot. And I know a couple of men in particular that kind of accusation thing happened to them, and they just left the education field. So guarding a reputation is kind of a cautionary tale to other educators after that. So you bring that into the realm. I've known pastors who will tell me that they've actually had parishioners. They'll say, "If you don't have an affair with me, I'll tell the congregation you did anyway." That's kind of a rugged thing. What are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
So I do think that there's a reputation to guard, but I don't know if the way to guard your reputation is to have like complete separation. There are ways to, at best, I don't know, maybe it's at worst, but at least you should be able to have a lunch with somebody of the opposite sex in a catchable place. So we go to lunch, and it's just the two of us, but we go to lunch at a place where we could get caught having lunch, by other people, rather than the idea that we have it in some intimate setting where nobody's ever going to see us. I mean, Brian Houston's a great example, who is the leader of Hillsong, who has just resigned over all kinds of charges, right? But one of the things that becomes the focus is that there was over a 50-minute period where he was alone with a woman in a hotel room. Okay. And it doesn't matter whether he claims it wasn't or not, it's that appearance that's damaged a reputation. And it was, in my opinion, a non-catchable environment. You can't catch him doing the right thing, so you assume he did the wrong thing. Okay. And so I do think that there are some things about a reputation that are valid, but I think you can guard your reputation in this one area and not be nearly as diligent in 5 other areas that are going to offend a whole nother group of people, And so I'm not saying you curate a reputation to be popular or to be credible. I am saying you curate a reputation around as much as you can perceive. You want to be perceived as a particular kind of person.
One thing that I really appreciated about you when we were all working together was the efforts you made to create inclusive spaces that sort of normalized like healthy collaboration between men and women, directors and support staff, pastors and all that. You created a meeting at a brewery that we did every Thursday that all the pastors and directors were invited to. And it was an intentional move away from a more siloed space for the people within those groups. Yeah. Do you think that is an approach to maybe a better way, an alternative solution to rules like this? Do you think like normalizing sort of healthy collaboration, I guess, would you say that's a step in the right direction?
Yeah, I think anything you can do for yourself to see men and women as your peers. I think that when you're a spiritual leader of a church, you can get caught in this thinking that no one's my peer. The only person who's my peer is another lead pastor. Like when I put together a cohort, if I have 5 or 6 lead pastors, they think he gets me. But if I put 3 lead pastors with a youth pastor and a worship pastor, they don't understand what I go through. And, I get it. There are unique pieces to it. But again, that robs maybe some emerging leaders from being able to pick the pocket of some established leaders, And so whether it's by rule or by gender, I think that the more we can do to level the playing field so that we don't see that I'm above you, and so I can't invite you into my world. I don't think anybody says that in a way that they have articulated it because it's a strategy. I think it's just leaks out as kind of like the operating system that they don't know they're running programs on.
Right. It's not overt. It's,
Yeah.
It's like a cultural
Yeah.
practice. Yeah.
One of the things that probably shaped how I view things is that the first 15 years of my ministry was with youth. And so you build ministry teams rather than elder boards. So your ministry team has guys and girls on it. You're not saying, the only people on our ministry team can be high school boys. It's guys and girls. And my thought was that I wasn't building a ministry to students. I was building a ministry of students. And so I had to figure out ways to help my students have their own ministry, right? And I remember having a ministry team meeting one time, and this girl goes, "Hey, you know what I hate about our ministry?" And I'm going, "That's my favorite evaluative question. What do you hate about our ministry?" I go, "What?" And she goes, "You always seal the deal." I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Whenever there's an invitation, whether it's to trust Christ or to yield a part of your life to him, you do it. How about letting us do it?" And that was a great observation from her for me to have to rework rather than, I actually said to her, "Give me an idea. What is that going to look like?" And she goes, "How about rather than ending with a proposition, you end with a question? So, and then let us have time to discuss it among ourselves." And that was really helpful for me to get off of center stage and to be more like creating an environment for ministry to happen peer to peer with all of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like there's kind of this elephant in the room with rules like this of one of the reasons it's particularly problematic for women in vocational ministry is the gender hierarchy that sits in the, doctrinal space of a lot of these environments. And it seems like there's this elephant in the room of, well, if we had more women in those spaces, there wouldn't be such an access problem for women as they try to grow, whether that's spiritually in leadership development. And I don't think it's merely a question of like, well, if we had women in leadership, then they could mentor women and the men would mentor men, but it would be more of an inclusive culture around those different ideas that when you've narrowed your leadership presence to, a certain population, whether it's men of a certain age or white men or, whatever, it limits the ideas that come into that space because those perspectives aren't there.
Yeah, but I don't think we're even aware that they're not there.
True.
I don't know what would be most helpful to a woman unless I ask. And so when I'm not asking, I'm assuming I know what's most helpful for them, And so when you're saying what perspective is gained in a lot of ways, the honest answer is I don't know. I'm sure it's bigger, but I don't know what it would look like,
I remember you shared a story about how, I think it was with a neighbor, that you're like going, I don't know your perspective. Can I have a relationship with you? Like invite me into a perspective and a story. Do you think it's the same transferable kind of like philosophy with women? Where it's like, I don't know unless I'm living life relationally with other people, if I'm not bringing in another perspective. The importance of like kind of like expanding your facets of understanding. You live here and you didn't know this was happening simultaneously.
So I think that there's a couple qualities that if we could differentiate them could help. One would be social responsibility. I would think most people feel a sense of social responsibility for equity. Okay? And I think the younger you are, the higher that feel, okay? But I think that there is an unfelt need for the need to be empathetic. And those are radically different. If we were to just take something like, I doubt if you could find somebody that doesn't think Black Lives Matter, but I think you could find a whole bunch of people that don't know anybody who's black. Okay, that's a social responsibility with low empathy, right? And so the whole idea of, I think women should be considered as equals. I mean, nobody's going to fight you on that, but they don't know what it's like to not be treated as an equal. Okay. So like I directed this university ministry, and on Mondays we would have our staff meeting, and on Tuesdays we would have our event. And so on Mondays I usually went over my talk with the staff, but it was usually a week out, okay? And so I go, here's what I'm talking about, here's what I'm thinking of using as illustrations. And I remember one time where 2 or 3 of the staff people said, you can't use that illustration, it's too emotionally gripping, it'll hijack, we won't stay with you, okay? And I would think the average communicator might go, perfect illustration, if it's going to just captivate the room, rather than listen to people that are 15 years younger than you and give them the authority to edit your talk so that you can talk to their peers, but you've let them be your peers in crafting your talk, And so if you really can learn the humility of letting people speak into your life, it does a lot to take away the detonation of authority. If you live with no talking, the talk is my responsibility, the music's your responsibility, the care groups are your responsibility, and we can all live in our own little silos, then we have to have some kind of referee to call who's out of bounds. But when we have blur, so that we all own to a very real sense what the talk's going to be, what the worship's going to be, and what care is going to look like, then the authority kind of melts away a lot. But the person with the authority has to give it away. The other people can't demand it.
2 things. 1, that was amazingly put. 2, I'm very impressed that you knew what you were going to preach about on Sunday, the Monday before.
You prepped? You had a plan? It's not Saturday?
I do want to widen the lens a little bit from the role we're talking about today to just the bigger issue of gender hierarchy. And one thing that always spoke to me, and I know many of the women around me, about your modeling of a more equitable place for women, was that you declined to become an elder at the church we all worked at together because women were not allowed to become elders. Can you share a bit about that? What were you hoping to model both to the women in our community and the leaders in our community as well?
Okay. I don't know if I had hey, leaders, take note, this is what I want you to learn.
Sure.
I do know that I had a conversation with a lot of women who felt like they couldn't do everything in the church because they couldn't be an elder. And I had a bias that kind of felt like you can do everything you've been gifted to do. If you had my job, what would you want to do that you can't do? So I was trying to let them see that sometimes a power differential is a perceived impediment on what you want to do, rather than the idea that it's an actual one. Now, I do agree with the idea that if someone's called a director of a ministry and someone else is called a pastor, or somebody's called a pastor, and yet there's this group of elders that all the pastors report to, that can come to a place where you feel like I am responsible to someone else for what my ministry will look like. But that wasn't our context. Our context really was that there were different roles, and elder role didn't keep the day-to-day ministry from happening in our church.
Do you think positions on what's often called women in ministry that include sort of a man over women hierarchy, even if it's just, hey, the elder role is off limits or we don't ordain women, do you think that kind of hierarchy marginalizes women in those environments, and why or why not?
It probably marginalizes women because of the unspoken assumptions and all that's involved in making that your DNA or culture, right? We look at, we don't necessarily look at it as the authority as much as somehow that's who God's going to work through. Maybe that's authority, you know what I mean? And so we've said at the highest level of God's working, men are responsible. That's a sad place, you know? I do think that regardless of your hierarchy, we can't have a organization that makes tiers of value. You know, I had a friend who pastored a church down in Florida, and he really did do a team-led church where there were, I think, 10 or 12 guys on staff, and I don't know if they were all guys, okay? But he said, when we're in staff meeting, I actually bring a gavel, and whoever's the person that, you know, like when we're doing worship and we're talking about the worship, whether it's the department or we're talking about a given Sunday, I give the gavel to the worship pastor. And they are the chairman of the
Judge
meeting.
of the
yeah,
moment.
Yeah. And so I said to him, how's that working? He goes, you can't have one person on your staff that's insecure. You know,
They have to wield the gavel at some point.
and let someone else have authority to speak into what might limit their programming. You know, and I think that's
a huge deal.
I think that's the big thing is that if you've got an old boys club, you don't feel like you're going to get limited. You know, and the minute you let a different perspective come in, that perspective might crowd me. You know, and I think that's a big deal, is letting yourself get crowded. You know, I've been in ministry long enough. I was teaching a spiritual disciplines class one time, and I had a pastor in the room. He goes, why haven't we heard about this before? And I don't know what disciplines I should be practicing. I hardly even know what gifts I have. I said, but I bet you know your entrepreneurial score, don't you? And he goes, yeah. And he told me the number, you know. and when we think that the ideal lead pastor is an entrepreneurial person, and a lot of times, you know, there are questions like, why do we love narcissists as leaders, right? So you put those two together, you really have a toxic cocktail, right? A narcissist and an entrepreneur. And when you do that, you probably have somebody who their independence index is way off the chart. And so they don't even think about the idea of including someone else because it's just going to be a drag of momentum. I will deploy people rather than engage them.
Yeah.
In a hierarchical system, accountability means who can hurt you or who can fire you. You know,
That's terrifying.
And, yeah, I mean, like as a dad, I had a 4-year-old daughter. I was accountable to. She can't fire me. You know, like Kenya. She can't fire me from being her dad, right? But she matters enough to me that I would change my life for her. And that's what this is. I mean, I was listening to a professor from NYU who was one of the framing voices in just looking at critical race theory. Okay, and I know that's a big topic that we're not talking about today. But one of the questions he was asked was, do you hope that white people will come to the place where you go, oh, we were wrong? He goes, I guess my hope really is that they would come to the place of saying it wasn't worth it. And that's kind of where I would hope pastors would get to. It's not worth the momentum, the bigness, the popularity, the amount of likes or followers I have. It's not worth it to have not included the rest of God's family in what I did.
Yeah. Wow. Kenya's clapping. Kenya's clapping. So last question. What would you say, and I feel like you've covered a lot of ground with this on a big say, but just maybe honing down to the practices. What would you say are the most important practices the church needs to address in its treatment of women?
That's an interesting thing because I think there is a huge difference between putting something in policy and asking people to kind of, in a sense, come up with their own rule of life. And I understand rule of life would speak into community, but like what you're talking about, with the Billy Graham rule, if that becomes part of what we're doing as a church, then whether it's your conviction or not, you're responsible for it, right? But if I'm saying, for example, I feel comfortable having dinner with a colleague on my staff or a colleague in my church and she's a leader, and someone else doesn't feel comfortable, I don't want to be at the place where they have to be comfortable because I am, and I shouldn't be at the place where I have to be uncomfortable because they are. Okay?
Yeah.
At the same time, when we're talking about accountability, I think you do need to figure out who are the voices in your life that matter enough that you would change your behavior, you know? So, for example, I was a youth pastor, and I had a girl in my youth group who got raped, okay? And as the youth pastor, I'm going to be part of the voice that leads her to healing. I'm not going to be the only voice, because obviously there's going to be some triggering just to having a male speaking in her life, right? But I knew enough to go, I don't want her to have to come to my office, because I don't want to have to walk through the hall. I don't want to have to go, who saw me come in here? Are they going to ask me what the issues are? So, we met at my house. But at the same time, I walked through the situation with my wife and said, okay, what's this going to look like? And she just made sure she was in the house. She didn't have to be in the room, but she was in the house. And whether that's the appearance of evil or whether that's just the idea, we work with people who are not always stable. This girl wasn't stable in trying to recover from this trauma, right? And so an unstable person, whether you lead a recovery ministry or whether you lead a divorce recovery ministry, there are people that are, if you were to talk to them 5 years into their recovery, are going to be way more stable than they were the first 6 months. So there's just some discernment that needs to be there, rather than just this hard, fast rule, no women, or what I mean? Because I think who the person is has a lot to do with what the boundaries should be. But again, see, that takes it out of this whole realm of transaction and keeps it as a relational dynamic. And that's really the interesting thing about ministry, is that you have the structure that almost feels business-like, but you have this dynamic that you're trying to create that's family. And you don't have that necessarily in the marketplace, and so you can have different rules at work outside the church than you do of work inside the church, where you're having to build a familial connection, not just an efficient one. Families are not efficient, friendships are not efficient.
Could I ask a question about continuing on that accountability track? What if you could dream a system that had healthy accountability within a church, that's more than just business, that's healthier maybe than a dysfunctional family? What, I don't know, dream a perfect world. What would that look like?
Oh, man. I've never seen it. I've had moments where I felt like that was good, and that was could have been better, But I know, for example, because I was responsible for overseeing a staff, I was responsible for how we would go about recruiting and hiring staff. And so a part that wasn't as healthy was when we were looking for, at that time we were looking for a women's ministry pastor, okay? I created a team of 8 women. I should have had a couple men on it, and yet I think most of the women would have said, why did they speak into, because they don't necessarily have an integrative flat view. They thought, since you guys have your own little sandbox to play in, this is ours, okay? And that's part of the dysfunction, But the other part was that we met for 3 months as a committee before we even opened it up to make sure that we were on the same page of what discipleship looked like. Okay, so then we searched and we came down to a short list, and that's when the conversations with the elders came into play, And a couple of the elders walked out of the room and looked at me and said, "You really discipled these women." that's part of what it looks like to have a peer environment. Is I'm not just connecting with these women to get the job done. If we were going to disciple people to be elders, why wouldn't we disciple people to call a pastor onto staff, you know? And so being able to look at the idea, they are my peers, they're going to make the decision. I'm not the kill switch on what they're going to do. My job is to equip them to be the best search committee ever. And so that's what I tried to do, you know?
Yeah. I think also I'm thinking like in terms of like, is there hope for healthy accountability? What would that look like? Whether it's doing well and choosing, being in a place where you're speaking into pastoral like hiring, or maybe if something is off, or maybe just speaking into the overarching health of a person and into one another's life. Is there space for something like that, and what could it look like?
Well, again, I think when you're using the word accountability, we've got to use it as a relational invitation rather than a whip. You know, we're not cracking the whip to keep you good. We're inviting you to be who you've been designed to be in Christ. And so having accountability structures when we're going to agree these matter to all of us. And so that's why we're going to do them. And you matter enough to me that if I don't do them, I'm going to need your help in either rebounding because I've offended you or violated our covenant. And I need not your judgment and not your punishment. I need your support and encouragement, you know? And that's rare air because again, we're so used to an employee and, work structure that we impose on a church. So the whole idea of what does accountability and equitable employment look like, and it really does need to be reevaluated in terms of how do we equip somebody to follow Jesus? You know, so if a woman, for example, is a gifted teacher, and we've told her you can only speak to 60% of the church, we haven't really necessarily invited her to a ministry path that lets her grow to her potential. We've given her, you can grow within your sandbox, you know, called women, and you can have women's ministry. And I'm not a place, you know, as weird as it is, I mean, I'm sure every complementarian that listens to this thinks that I'm not one, you know? And there's probably mutualists who'll go, yeah, you just kind of got some complementarian going on in there, you know? And I don't know if I would comfortably wear a label, but I do feel like there is a place for men and women to complement each other together, rather than the best way for us to complement each other is to just do exactly the same thing. You know, I think I'm a better team member when I cannot be ashamed of my maleness, and you're a better team member when you can be your femaleness, you know, but when we both have to say, those are our differences, so let's get down to a bottom line of our commonality, that's no different than if we just said, because you're different, you're not going to get to play with us, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one thing that strikes me about the rule we're talking about is it is sort of a lazy way to deal with that complexity. But I think as you articulated, it's not worth it. There's a detriment that's a little bit too impactful for so many people in our midst. And even the overall flourishing of our community, right? Is there are real problems to tackle there. You know, you brought up some really key terms there, I think. Discernment, accountability, and relational equity. That's a little bit harder to dig into, a little bit more time consuming, but it's definitely worth the effort, it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, I do think that if we have, if you are given all this authority because of your position, then you don't want to share it. Mm. But if we start seeing ourselves as the only authority I have in someone's life is how I matter to them. If I'm a pastor in a church, my influence is going to grow the longer I'm in the relationship with those people, right? Because they're going to have crises where I get to be the person that helps them walk through their crises. There's going to be young people that come up into the church that I'm going to get to do their wedding. You know, I was talking to one pastor who's getting ready to retire, and I said, "So what bugs you the most?" He goes, "When people just don't respond to the gospel or lie to me. And I go, well, give me an example of people lying to you. He goes, well, like I had this couple that was in our church since they were kids, and I was doing their premarital, and I was asking whether or not they're involved sexually, and they told me no. And he goes, the more we got into it, she was already pregnant. He goes, it just really bugs me. And I said, well, okay, so can I just ask you, and I'm kind of going, maybe your empathy score is really low or something, because these people have grown up with you being their spiritual, in some ways father, but their spiritual leader their entire life, and then you're asking them to come clean on a sin, and maybe you haven't talked to them about anything ever personal like that before. Of course they're going to want you to think well of them. The lie wasn't just because we'll just lie about it. It was more, there's shame that's, part of the thing. The whole idea, I'm going to let you down, you're going to disapprove of us, maybe you won't even do our wedding. There's all kinds of things that play into that. And for you to just make this one assumption that they are liars is terrible, and that same thing can happen when I don't know you, and so you don't include any women in your discussion, so I think that you're a chauvinist, rather than the idea, you've never really even considered the idea that there's a bigger perspective and give you any kind of benefit of the doubt, Yeah. And on the other side of a guy saying, I've never really thought about the idea that bringing in the perspective of some of the women in my church could help me have a bigger perspective, rather than simply going, okay, I have this reasoned out thing and I don't want to add the emotional piece. And that is just such a debilitating category
Yeah.
to put any of us in, if you were to talk to my wife, she would say, when I need to talk to Bill, I need to ask him the question, what are you thinking? Because all he's going to tell me is what he's feeling. And, and with her, it's exactly the opposite. I need to ask her what she's feeling, because she's had a abusive past where feelings get stuffed or ignored or escaped from. And so they're not her friends, and, so you could walk into our relationship and go, wow, you guys have your roles reversed. I'm going, no, this is who we are,
Yeah.
One of the most encouraging parts of knowing you, Bill, is the way that you have spoken value into my life, and I've seen you speak value into the lives of other women. I think in part that has to do with the fact that you come to the table not knowing all the answers. And I don't assume that like you started this way. I feel like you've grown into this much more empowering and inclusive, specifically to women, pastor and leader and shepherd. But it starts with low ego. And I think there's a sense of curiosity and wonder that you're almost entering into a relationship almost as a student. And you could come with a lot of answers, and based on like the years that you've been in ministry and your wisdom, all of that, you could come knowing basically what's going on, like in a counseling situation, or like even on a church planting situation. You're like, this is the structural issue, this is the issue in the marriage, like whatever it is. But one thing that's unique about the way I've seen you lead is you come in with that knowledge and with that wisdom. And then also you have space to listen, that there's an opportunity to learn. If you could encourage future pastors, both men and women, kind of in that vein, on maybe something that you've learned in that space, what could that be? It's definitely anti how we're brought up with our modern understanding of theology. It's very scrappy. You have to always know the answer. Yeah. You have to be right. You have to have the correct theology. You need to know it from front to back, and your enemy's theology, so that you can like beat them to the punch and then maybe beat them down as well. What is a way that we can dream of doing something different and maybe some beauty behind it?
I think I spent the first half of my ministry being the person you described and that you say I'm not. My wife had cancer for over 6 years, and then she died. And I'm sad that she died. I wish she'd never had cancer. I don't believe she did anything wrong or I did anything wrong, that was God's punishment. I believe that any punishment any of us receive for our sin is on the cross. If God deals with us, it's in loving discipline, not in wrathful punishment, But when my wife died, this is a weird thing, but for 31 years, I had an identity called husband. And in 1 minute, I wasn't. And I had all these behaviors of husband behavior that no longer had an anchor for why I would behave like that, And I had to kind of go through an identity crisis of who am I if I'm not a husband? Do I not eat Cocoa Puffs because my wife didn't want me to, and now I don't have a wife. I can eat Cocoa Puffs. Whatever happens to be the case, that there is just, I had to go through an entire reorg because I didn't have an identity in Christ. I had an identity from my environment and my circumstances. And I think as long as a pastor describes himself primarily as a pastor, then they've got to play the role. And that's knowing the answers or whatever, the vision of being a pastor is going to be that you step into, rather than the idea that I'm a Christ follower and I know some of the freedoms of that, and I know some of the limitations that are imposed on me because of that. And they aren't all the same for every person. So my job isn't to make you have mine, but my job is to make sure that the ones you have aren't misplaced. That you don't have values because you're a man or values because you're a woman. You have values because of your Christ following, and they get expressed in the roles you have. They get expressed in the environment and the relationships you have. But we don't have nearly the grounding in our identity in Christ that allows life to throw different circumstances our way and not be rocked by it.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yeah.
For talking to us. It's so good. We got to do this in person, which is amazing.
I know.
Haven't gotten to catch up in a bit. So
Yeah, it's been great. I hope you got some stuff you can use.
Oh my There's a lot of good stuff. Oh, we love Bill, and we are so grateful to have had him join us on this episode. While this is a podcast with an emphasis on a woman's perspective in ministry, we did want to have an honest conversation with both sides of the equation. We think that conversations held like this with friends like Bill are a perfect example of healthy peers in ministry. It breaks down gender barriers, age differences, and simply embodies the camaraderie of people who respect one another, with nothing to lose and only a broader understanding of each other to gain. There is space for all of us at God's table. In the same way, may we all find ways to create space for one another, helping each other up along the way. May we hear each other well, listening to our stories, perspectives, with a sense of wonder and curiosity. May we learn the humility of speaking into each other's lives. There's space for you. There's space for all of us, not created by our strength, but gifted freely. May we too extend that free gift to all. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Stained Glass Ceiling. Thank you so much for listening. We wanted to extend a special thank you to Bill Clem for his interview today, to Ailin, Kenya, and Becca for all your hard work keeping this podcast alive, and as always to Alan for mastering. Today's episode featured music off my record So Far So Long, and as always, we will list any resources mentioned in today's podcast in our show notes. Now, we are taking a break for the holidays, but we do have more episodes coming up in the new year. So hang tight and love each other well in the meantime.